So while I had been involved in kite testing for many years, it wasn't on the design side. My area of experience was in kite board design. But from this I knew that once you get locked into design components that are working, a rocker line or an outline, those combinations start to take on a life of its own, and it becomes really hard to throw that all out and start in a completely new direction. And so the Cloud was my first kite design, and I didn't want to just rely on assumptions that things needed to be the way they are. I wanted my first exploration into kite design to really test the function of each part. There was some small hope that strutless might work, or work in ways and influence kite design going in a different direction. But more than that, I thought it was really just going to be a learning lesson of why things are the way they were with kite design at the time, and it would be a process of adding those things back on. My process began by grabbing all of the kites I could that I had flown and measuring and digitizing them and attempting to attach performance characteristics to different design components to create a library, a database to start my kite design from. Some of those things are easy to measure, wrap your mind around, but other parts are real mysteries. You can measure a profile shape at a strut, but at what angle of attack that connects to a leading edge and what angle of attack it flies at are really big questions. And so my first designs weren't radical in the sense of aspect ratios or other parts of a kite. It was largely just a stripped down kite. I think perhaps there's a magic in those variables, in the guesswork of not knowing how other kites are put together, that made the performance, the design of the Cloud and its performance different. A part of that perhaps is that most of the industry uses the same software, which has a lot of shortcuts in design, and I've never used that. Every kite is designed without shortcuts, so every part of it is designed with exacting attention and care. Kite design can be like an art. Every artist has their style, has their combination of solutions to the different design components. And so while clouds have differences one generation to the next, they all share a common family of feeling and summary personality. The day the first kites arrived and we flew them is a day I'll never forget, and one of the happiest days of my life. I went straight from picking them up over to the beach to meet my brother. It was a fairly light wind day, but had to try to fly them. Didn't imagine that they would even necessarily fly, or if they flew that they would not fly well and have some major flaws. We unpacked the box and I was already smiling and pumped them up, and they held air, which was already amazing. And my brother gave me a launch, and I was sort of holding my breath going, what's even going to happen is going to be a disaster, be ready to bail. And the amazing thing is it flew great. Not just the kite, but the bridling and the tuning, it was all really close. It was amazing to me that it would fly and already be interesting. And it was a shock. Given the light wind, I had a sense that there was enough power there, and I thought to take it on the water. And I was going and loving it. The very first kite, the very first run, it was my new favorite piece of equipment. And that's not a small statement. I didn't have, I wasn't generally quick to change favorites. When I had a kite I loved, I would sometimes keep it for years, and new models would come out, and I didn't necessarily adopt them. I was very particular always about the performance of the gear I rode, and passionate about it. And so to feel this way about my own very first kite design was just amazing. So I only took a tack or two, and I came straight in and I said, brother, you got to try this. He's a bit bigger than me, and that I could go on an 8 in those light winds. I wanted to see what he could do, and I immediately went to pump up to 6-meter kite. And in what seemed like too light a wind, for me to have been powered up, feeling perfect on a 6, and that the two of us could be on the water within 15 minutes of opening that box and launching the first cloud kites, was just a magical experience. It was with some good fortune, luck, that those kites worked so great. Years later now, and having made so many different prototypes and testing different design ideas, some relatively small variations don't work great and take a lot of effort to even fly. And if I had landed on one of those combinations with my first, I would have assumed that that's why there was no other strutless kites in the skies of Maui, that it was just a failed concept. So it's just with great luck that the first designs landed on something amazing and really became the focus of my work for the years following since then. While the first kites were so great, there was still clearly some areas for improvement. And that's really where the work started. It wasn't altogether challenging to design the first kites and to have them 95% perfect in the first round. That's easy, but to get the performance from 95% to 100% was where all the work took place over the next year. Rounds and rounds of prototyping, so much work on bridling, to get the kites to a point where we wanted to share them with others. The idea to try a strutless kite was inspired in part by my experience windsurfing. Windsurfing wave sails, when you sheet out, the profile goes flat, and it gives it a very different power handling than a camber-induced race sail. And I had always seen the struts on kites and the way they connected to the leading edge the same way as a camber-induced batten in a windsurf sail. And so my interest was to see that if a kite design that when you sheet out, that the profile can go flat, would give that same sort of power handling. I found out it does apply to kites, that there's a lot of other design criteria that are involved in that, like bridling, for example. And a lot of work went into refining and developing the cloud concept before the introduction of the C.5 Cloud, to just keep pushing further and further to get that total amount of depower that we were after. Unlike windsurfing, sheeting out and changing the wing's profile shape has different and new and exciting effects when you apply the idea to a kite. These were completely unexpected, and it is a big part of what is so exciting to me about the cloud. Unlike the windsurf sail, that when you sheet out, you're sheeting in and out on a relatively two-dimensional plane. The sail's in your hands holding onto the boom. With a kite flying at the end of the kite lines, when you sheet out and that profile changes shape, it affects the kite's position in the window. And so when you sheet out, the kite positions back. And that does amazing things for the kite drifting and giving you total freedom to ride downwind and have the kite keep up with you. Or even just standing on the beach, that the kite's not going to fly out and potentially overfly the edge of the window in gusty or variable winds shifting direction. The kite's parked in a really stable position. When you're out riding and you go into a transition and you sheet the kite out to depower, as you finish your transition and you want to power back up, when you sheet in, the kite is at a position deeper in the power zone, and so you have the option of controlling its power without having to wave the kite as aggressively to position the kite back into the power window just by steering the kite. So it has all these amazing implications, which I think is directly related to the strutless platform, but also needs to work in a combination with other design components, like having the bridling and the balance point of the kite to give it enough freedom to be able to have the angle of attack changes to have these effects. So a kite isn't defined by any one single characteristic, a strut count, or simply a weight or an aspect ratio. I think a lot of times these deceive us, and we attach certain performance characteristics to these criteria, but in reality my experience has clearly been that changing any one of these variables affects all the others, and so looking at any one in isolation doesn't speak to the performance of the kite. A great example of that was shortly after I had launched the first Cloud. I was out riding one day and I looked upwind and I saw what looked like a cloud. I knew it wasn't, but it looked so similar. I rode upwind to check it out, see what was going on, and I found it was the design team from another kite brand visiting Maui, and they had an identical looking prototype. And I was excited. I tracked them down on the water and joined them into the beach and introduced myself with full excitement and suggested let's trade kites and try each other's. And I'm so glad I did, because their kite flew completely different, and I never would have guessed it. I had incorrectly assumed that certain performance characteristics would be inherent to strutless kites. For example, I thought that the lack of struts was allowing the tension across the trailing edge not to be disrupted, and that the highly sensitive, responsive steering I was getting on the Clouds, I assumed was inherent to a strutless platform. But theirs flew so completely differently that it was clear that even just little changes will give a kite a completely different personality. Years into Cloud designs now, when I'm asked by people that the concept is new to, why strutless, I'm at a loss for words to try to even begin to describe. It's the performance is so natural to me, and other kites have become so strange that for me the question is really, why struts? I think struts were put on early kite designs because they were a considerably different shape and had surface area convex to the trailing edge that needed support of struts. But when the leading edges of kites started sweeping back, I believe struts became no longer necessary on all kite designs. The idea of kites without struts I don't think is a new idea at all. Parafoil. My first kite was a parafoil kite, a buggy kite, and was strutless, and I never forgot the simplicity and how compact that was, and I think it's natural that I came back to that simplicity in exploring the Cloud design. One of the things I'm really proud about for the Cloud is that its design intention and its performance is true to what we want to ride. It's not designed for some imaginary rider. It's for us and riders that share an interest in the same handling characteristics. from the very first prototypes, they had such great range with such radically extended low wind range and equal high end range. So that was amazing. How light they felt and how responsive they were. It was already nearly an ideal kite. What we worked hard on before the launch of the first Cloud was extending its depower range. My wife was learning to kite at the time, and I wanted her to be able to launch a kite on a gusty beach, and if a gnarly puff of wind comes through, that if she sheets that bar out, she's not going to get drug. As little pull is left through the front of the kite into the front lines into the rider's harness. And the original Cloud was the first kite I'd ever flown that we had reached that level of depower. My brother and I were riding surfboards at the time, and for surfing or strapless freestyle, we also loved being able to turn the power off as much as possible at will. The Cloud isn't different, it's not a mistake, and it's not the result of any one design characteristic, but the Cloud's performance is well and truly the result of a lot of focused work taking its performance in exactly that direction to really be what we wanted to ride. Prior to developing the Cloud, the largest kite in my quiver was 8 meters. I found bigger kites too slow and not enough fun to fly to be worth it. And so I didn't go into kite development with the intention of making any larger sizes. It was just entirely the result of flying them and the performance we were getting that widened our focus into larger kites and lighter wind. It's wild that the most popular size in the C.5 Cloud was the 17 meter. Riding on Maui, we're not specialists in light wind, and the 17 being so popular, I think, just speaks to the greater need of improvement in kites in that light wind category. And so the lighter weight and the faster responsiveness of the Cloud really brought a lot of benefit to the bigger kites and lighter wind. I hadn't been focused on weight necessarily with the development of the original Cloud. This was the main focus in the early development of the C2. After launching the C1, I had done an experiment which didn't really pan out, but it had added a little weight to the kite, and that taught me how influential the kite's weight was in the low wind advantage we were getting in the Cloud. The main area for weight reduction that I saw was in the leading edge, the bladder and the leading edge material. And the only way to cut that I saw without compromising the durability and longevity of the materials is in using less materials and a smaller diameter leading edge. The leading edge diameter has a huge effect on the rigidity of the kite's C arc shape. And so testing the boundaries of how small a diameter leading edge could be flown, could perform well, placed all sorts of different requirements on the bridling to better support that leading edge. And so exploring the C2 bridles design to build that leading edge support back in, I revisited the idea of moving parts in a bridle. Developing the C1 Cloud, I had tested kites with and without pulleys, and the kites with pulleys depowered more, so I assumed it was a result of the pulleys. When I tested this again, specifically in development of the C2 Cloud, I found that I had assumed incorrectly. I was able to get the depower I wanted with a fixed bridle, and that the fixed bridle had so much more to offer in terms of supporting the leading edge in a stable way. What I had found in development of the C2 was that the moving parts on the C1's bridle allowed the leading edge shape to distort under the higher loads of stronger winds and diminish performance at the high end of the range, where the fixed bridle on the C2 better supported that leading edge arc shape and keeps a more consistent canopy shape and far more comfortable performance into a higher wind range. So while I had been focused on weight and the low end of the range and development of the C2, it was somewhat by accident that what I learned about the revised bridling for that smaller diameter leading edge made the biggest change to the C2, its high-end wind range. The C2 was launched in February of 2014, and following that I started work for what would be the next design updates in Cloud. This was originally focused on the idea of trying to develop tuning options to reduce the depower range of the Cloud and basically just give it the option for more conventional handling. I was able to do this. I had an 8-meter prototype, for example, that had so little freedom in its angle of attack changes that you couldn't even get the canopy to luff, and you could still ride it. You know, the bar would still feel comfortable on this 8-meter kite in wind conditions that I'd be fully lit up on a 5-meter C2. But development in this direction really never went anywhere for me, because while I was successful in achieving what I was looking for, it wasn't performance that was interesting to me or my riding, or would be anything I would recommend to a friend. So it kind of stopped there and didn't influence any changes to the Cloud. Following that, kite development was influenced in a completely different direction by my riding switching to hydrofoils. I was super stoked to feel like the Cloud was an awesome kite for this new riding style, and I wanted to see how far I could take the Cloud design to be optimized for the new opportunities of hydrofoil riding. I feel like a lot of kiting gear, hydrofoil kiting gear, is heavily influenced by the racing scene, and this is appropriate in many regards due to its huge influence. Turning upside down the racing scene. And so while my riding is very, very different, the kite designs I was exploring were influenced by the parafoil kites, which began to dominate the hydrofoil racing scene. So for the next year, I explored high and super high aspect ratios, super flat arc shapes, double surface teardrop leading edges, and all sorts of pretty far out designs, really pushing the boundaries and trying to optimize efficiency to windward and speed and everything I could imagine. A lot of the stuff worked, some better than others, but none of it challenged the C2 as being my choice for my riding. And for a moment I got to a point where I thought perhaps I had run out of what I thought would be an infinite list of things, ideas to want to explore. But sort of the second that happened, all I needed to do was to look down at my hydrofoil and see the components of its design, the attributes of its design that I had been had recognized so strongly as being a fit for my hydrofoil riding interests in comparison to race foils, and then to look up and see that those same design attributes and performance characteristics would apply to the kites I wanted to fly. And the next round of prototypes, as influenced by that idea, were lower aspect ratio, more compact, and the results were immediately exactly what we wanted to fly. A whole year of searching crazy ideas, and the solution was always right under our feet. In ways, the C.5 is a radical departure from the C2's design, but in other ways they share a lot of similarities in their balance points and profile shaping. It's almost like if you took a C2 and chopped the wingtips off at 45 degrees and kept the same wingtip width as the C2 and just swept the leading edge back to meet it. If you can visualize that, what that does is it keeps the balance point of the kite in a similar way. I had begun to look at the wingtips of a kite as sort of dead weight and drag. And so I wanted, in flat arc shapes, I was really trying to find ways of eliminating them. But what exploring flatter arc shapes had taught me was, I think, how very influential tension across the trailing edge of the kite in relation to the kite's C arc shape is in that power delivery and how we feel a kite. So the C.5 is a really compact C shape to have a ton of tension traveling across the trailing edge of the kite. The longer length trailing edges of kites, I found that some of our input to the kite is sort of dispersed throughout the kite and sort of softens the effect as the kite bends and moves. And so the super compact shape of the C.5 is just even more direct. Less of that tension is lost, and so feedback to and from the kite just feels more immediate. The dream I had that inspired me to get into hydrofoiling was a vision of being able to do flying 360s, carving up into the wind. I think that vision speaks to the performance characteristics of what I want from the gear I ride, both from the hydrofoil and from the kite. And a C.5 was developed to be exactly that. I want the depower to be able to carve straight up into the wind, and I want the glide ratio from the hydrofoil to be able to carry that speed into the wind, and I want the immediate steering responsiveness to have kite control throughout the transition, and the low aspect lift to have the power through the kite to power me out of transition as speed has slowed and lift is on the border of stalling, both up into the wind or as well as carving off the wind, have incredible drift, and to still have control and responsiveness from the kite to scream off the wind as well, to have a super efficient kite, to be able to ride as small a kite as possible for the fastest possible responsiveness and lively steering speed and fun to ride. C.5 became its working title just for no other reason other than the first prototype turned out to be a half size. I wasn't designing with a particular size in mind. It was a wind range, and the C.5 5.5 was modeled off of the C.27 in terms of its chord length from leading edge to trailing edge at center, and I was trying to target a similar wind range in this new shaping, and the size just turned into a C.5. It worked so great, it started the ball rolling in that direction, and the wind range was perfectly suiting how we wanted to ride, and so the other sizes spun off from there. It took 2 years to introduce updates to the Cloud design now for the C.5. It's an amazing freedom not to have to design kites to any calendar schedule, but just as performance updates are possible, letting the performance direct when updates are made. And even more amazing to be an independent brand, not to have to compromise the gear in any direction and have the total freedom to develop exactly the gear we're most passionate about and we want to share with our friends and family.